Hello, my name is Rebecca Reznik-Zellen. I am the head of Research and Scholarly Communication Services at Lamar Soutter Library at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And I am going to talk a little bit about data policies and data ownership. What I hope to get across in this time is first to introduce the different types of policies that govern research data, and then to briefly discuss the impacts that those policies have on research projects and specifically on data sharing. And then also to briefly describe some of the legal issues that are connected to research data, specifically data ownership. So to begin with a definition, a policy is a formal document that outlines principles of behavior that are thought to be desirable or necessary as expressed by a government or other authoritative body. As such, policies convey expectations and drive decision-making within organizations, and they attempt to influence behavior for some particular reason, whether that behavior is to avoid some negative effect or to bring about some positive benefit. Policies provide incentives for action or requirements to be followed, and they have driven much of the need for research data management services. An Association of Research Libraries survey conducted in 2013 predicted that the need for universities to manage their research data for access and preservation would grow due, among other things, to the increasing requirements and enforcement of data sharing policies from research funders and other bodies. But policies are not necessarily arbitrary, and they operate within a larger context. For biomedical research data, that context is the larger international scientific research environment. And that environment recognizes data as a public good, as something that is critical for addressing global challenges and whose growth is dependent upon exchange and collaboration. So, for example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international non-governmental body whose function is to advise national scientific policymaking and funding organizations, released in 2007 their principles and guidelines for access to research data from public funding. These principles, first of all, acknowledge that access to research data increases the returns from public investment in this area, reinforces open scientific inquiry, encourages diversity of studies and opinion, and promotes new areas of work. The document itself outlines 13 different principles for the handling and management of research data. It is intended really to help member countries develop good policies for research data management and handling, to promote improved scientific and social return on investment, to promote data access and data sharing, not just among researchers, but among nations as well. And of course, following that, to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the global scientific system. Similarly, national agencies and policy-making bodies also have statements regarding the value of research data and acknowledging data as a public good. For example, Research Councils UK issued in 2011 Common Principles on Data, and that policy states that research data is a public good and should be made available quickly and responsibly. Similarly, in the United States, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in 2013 issued a directive which noted a commitment to ensure that the results of federally funded research data are made available quickly and responsibly. These overarching funder policies, because both of these are umbrella organizations, seek to maximize the return of public investment in science via transparency and sharing. They're also concerned about competitiveness. The Canadian Research Council is quoted as saying, "The way that we choose to manage our research data will directly impact our ability to undertake leading-edge research and development in the future." So that is another concern for the national policy-making bodies with regard to research data. So the high-level policies like the OECD and the RCUK influence one another, and they also have sort of a trickle-down effect. National directives influence individual funding agency policies, such as those of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. So for instance, the RCUK oversees 7 disciplinary councils that fund research across a broad spectrum of disciplines. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, the statement that they issued in 2013 directly impacts 22 agencies in the United States with more than $100 million in research expenditure, also across disciplines. Now, those agencies themselves give grants to research institutions like Harvard or MIT or the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And those institutions have investigators that are conducting research and communicating their science through scholarly communication channels and data publication. As Kathleen Shearer notes, policies are an extremely powerful lever to push the community forward, and this is an example of how they all sort of fit together. As a researcher, there are 3 of these policies that are going to directly impact you. The first are funder policies, those of the NIH and the NSF. And these organizations are concerned with transparency, with reproducibility, and data sharing specifically because, like the national directives and the shared principles that they reflect, they're interested in making science more efficient and having return on their investment. Institutional infrastructure, which includes, importantly, institutional policies for data, are focused more on compliance for data management and data handling, and are also concerned with, institutions are also concerned with protecting their employees and themselves. So institutional policies in this context are going to be focused more on stewardship and handling of data, as well as data ownership. And then at the investigator practice level, we have publisher policies, because here, this is where an individual investigator is actually going forward and communicating their science. Publishers are concerned with validating the conclusions that they publish. So they are also concerned with reproducibility. But they're concerned also with verification of the data that they are getting and making available. So these 3 groups of policies are the policies that directly impact a researcher, and we're going to take a quick look at each of them in turn. So the first type of policy that directly impacts researchers are the funder policies. In 2015, Kathleen Shearer conducted an environmental scan of Canadian, European, Australian, and American funder data policies, and she identified some common objectives for these policies, which are to improve the efficiency of and accelerate research, support the reuse of data for new insights, foster collaboration, and facilitate transparency. Again, these reflect the sentiments of the shared principles and national statements on research data. At the same time, a study conducted in 2012, so a little bit earlier, a study conducted in 2012 by Diane Dietrich, which examined 26 United States-specific funder policies in order to determine some common characteristics among them, found the policies to be fairly general in scope, to not specifically address standards very thoroughly, to focus on access more than preservation, and to not be overly concerned with publication. The Data Res project, which is a project out of the University of North Texas funded by the Institutes of Museum and Library Science, also found similar results in a 2013 study where there was little consistency across agencies in data management guidance that they were giving to researchers or documentation. So the findings of these 2 studies demonstrate a disconnect between the content of funder policies on one hand and their stated goals on the other. And in part, that is because these policies are dynamic and they're evolving over time. To look a little bit closer at US funder policies in brief, this is a very abbreviated timeline for funder policies on research data that focuses specifically on major milestones with regard to data management and sharing. HIPAA legislation that was signed into effect in 1996, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And its goal was to basically enable agencies to be able to protect the privacy of an individual's health information while also enabling them to be able to adapt to new technologies. So what HIPAA does is it defines policies and procedures and guidelines for maintaining the privacy and security of protected health information and personally identifiable information. Specifically, that information that is handled by healthcare providers or by anyone who is transmitting healthcare data. And this would include clinical and basic science researchers. So on the one hand, HIPAA had something of a chilling effect on biomedical research because there were now requirements and consequences for not protecting the privacy of data that's being shared. Fast forward a couple of years, in 2003, the National Institutes of Health issued a data sharing requirement. This is a major funding policy for biomedical research, and it states that data sharing is essential for expedited translation of research results into knowledge, products, and procedures to improve human health. So the NIH data sharing plan basically requests any investigator who is seeking awards of over $500,000 to write a brief statement describing how they intend to share their research data. So it begins to set a precedent for the sharing of data back in 2003. Although there's not much in terms of enforcement for that particular policy. Again, if we jump ahead a couple more years to 2011, the National Science Foundation issued a data management plan requirement. Again, a major funding policy that is cross-disciplinary and is affecting many people. The data management plan requirement stipulates that any submitted proposal, so for any amount of money, for anyone seeking an award from NSF, must also submit a plan for data management that meets the requirements of the NSF sharing and dissemination policy. That policy states that investigators are expected to share with other researchers at no more than incremental costs and in a reasonable amount of time the data for their research. Importantly, the National Science Foundation Data Management Plan requirements sets some very strong expectations for what is included in a data management plan. They specifically want these plans to address data types and formats, standards for data documentation, policies for access and sharing, policies for reuse and redistribution of data, as well as preservation and archiving. So this is a very robust and detailed requirement that is put into effect in 2011 and affects many researchers. Then, in 2013, shortly after the 2011 NSF requirement, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which again is an overarching policy body that affects many agencies, issued a directive to the heads of agencies that had more than $100 million in research and development expenditure that they needed to develop a plan to support increased public access to the results of research. This includes both publications as well as digital data. So this was in 2013, and this is also a very big move because now it's not just focused on one particular agency, it's cross-agency, cross-discipline, and it has very, very broad reach. Since this was issued in 2013, agencies have been responding to this as late as 2015. And today, 17 of 22 agencies have issued their responses to the OSTP memo. This table tracks the agency responses to the memo. It identifies what different agencies are proposing to do whether or not their policies address publications and data or both of them. Remember, it is supposed to address both of these products. Whether or not a data management plan is required, what are other policy stipulations, and whether or not they're going to provide support to investigators who are going to be meeting these requirements. At this level, which is a fairly high level, some consistency is emerging, particularly with the requirement for a data management plan. 13 of 17 agencies that have responded to the OSTP memo will be requiring data management plans from their investigators. So that's forward progress. I will also note that 5 agencies of the Department of Health and Human Services, of which the NIH is one, represents over $31 billion of research expenditures. So overall, across the 22 agencies, there's huge potential for a large amount of publicly funded research to soon be well managed and made publicly available. For biomedical research, the National Institutes of Health is a very important funding agency. At the University of Massachusetts Medical School, for example, 70% of the research conducted here is funded through the National Institutes of Health. The current NIH requirement is the data sharing policy established in 2003, which I just mentioned. Again, it asks investigators seeking more than $500,000 in support to provide a description of how their final research data will be shared or to explain why it cannot be shared. Importantly, their policy notes that given the breadth and variety of science that NIH supports, neither the precise content for the data documentation nor the formatting, presentation, or transport mode will be stipulated. So because of this lack of guidance, data sharing plans in practice have been very short documents with very few details about how, when, to whom, or under what conditions data could be shared. So this has been the policy that's been in place at the NIH for a very long time. You will note also that data sharing policies are not included in the review of an applicant's application's scientific merit. And although the NIH expects that what an investigator says they're going to do in their data sharing plan, that they do it, there really is no enforcement mechanism for this. Now, in 2015, in February of 2015, the NIH released their response to the OSTP memo, which outlined how they were going to make some modifications to their data sharing plan. Specifically, note that they, with regard to digital data, they state that they will be expanding its data sharing policy beyond the current requirement. In detail, they outline changes to the data sharing plan that it will extend to all researchers being funded, not just those that are seeking more than $500,000, and that it will require a data management plan that is modeled on the National Science Foundation. As described, the National Science Foundation Data Management Plan is a much more robust document and does provide guidance or expectations around the how, when, to whom, and under what circumstances that this data will be shared. So these are important changes to the NIH data sharing policy, and we expect that they will be going into effect during the 2016 calendar year. So we'll see what happens with that. These things take time. This is an overview table of the NIH response to the OSTP memo. So you'll note here that the submission of the data management plan is required, as is deposit of data into appropriate existing publicly accessible repositories, and importantly, that there are enforcement actions, including the withholding of funds for those folks who are not going to be taking these actions. So this is definitely a heavier requirement for investigators who are seeking awards from NIH, but it is moving along in the right direction to support data sharing and the efficiency of science. And it's very different from the 2003 data sharing requirement. Apart from the NIH, there are 4 other Health and Human Services operational divisions which meet the OSTP threshold of $100 million in annual research and development expenses. And these 5 together account for 99% of HHS research expenditures. So the Department of Health and Human Services sort of issued a sort of overarching response to the OSTP memo and indicated that they're going to be utilizing existing infrastructure that has been developed by the National Libraries of Medicine to manage their publications and their digital data, such as PubMed Central, PubMed, and NCBI databases. Their approach for supporting public access to digital data is going to be pragmatic. It's been characterized as pragmatic, taking a stepped approach, assessing what they can do, doing an inventory of their data, requesting data management plans, issuing pilots, so taking a very pragmatic approach. Looking at these other 4 HHS agencies together, you can see that they're consistent among themselves. They're also consistent with what the NIH has proposed. Again, submission of a data management plan, deposit of data into a discipline or agency repository, and enforcement actions again here as well. So together these reflect the larger influence of U.S. Office of Science and Technology policy and other funding agencies in moving toward public access of funded research products. By implementing these policies, they hope to influence the actions of institutions and investigators who conduct research. So the second type of policy that directly impacts researchers are institutional data policies. Institutions are the legal entities to which research awards are granted from funding bodies. Therefore, they have an interest, a vested interest, in ensuring that their faculty comply with funder mandates and requirements. They are ultimately the responsible party for these awards. Institutions are also interested in protecting their intellectual property and protecting the financial interests of the institution. Therefore, institutional policies are going to focus on data management and stewardship in a very broad sense by delineating rights and responsibilities and setting expectations for data management on their campus. They also address data ownership. Among the objectives of institutional data policies, there are some other benefits that come with having institutional policies regarding data, and one is to accommodate for the mobility of researchers. Researchers move around, their careers take them to different institutions, and sometimes the data that's being created at an institution needs to stay at the institution, or an investigator might want to take that data with them. There's policies that govern those kinds of transactions. A data policy will also accommodate longitudinal studies, research that takes place over decades. Think of climate research, think of longitudinal social studies. Investigators are going to cycle through those long-term projects, and so the institution is a natural home for that data, and there needs to be guidelines in place for how the institution is going to handle those data over time. An institutional data policy will also support researchers who don't have external funding, who may be funded from within the institution and need some guidelines on how they should handle their data as well. The Australian National Data Service provides a framework for effective data management within an institutional context, and they include policy as an essential part of that framework, along with infrastructure and support services that are fundamental to life cycle support. So policy is considered infrastructure in this context. Some elements of institutional policies, things that they need to address, for instance, are the scope, definitions of data, what data means in this particular context for this institution. Ownership here is a very important theme. Who has ownership of the data and when is ownership transferred? Issues about retention and disposition of data. How long does research data need to be maintained for that institution in order for it to protect its interests? And how are ethical considerations being addressed? How does the institution require that an investigator deal with ethical concerns, such as requirements for IRB or IACUC or others? Institutional policies might also address issues around access and sharing. And importantly, they describe the different roles and responsibilities for the different stakeholders on campus, of which there might be many. Apart from the university itself, there's the Office of Research, there's research compliance, information technology, who might be managing some of the technological infrastructure for handling research data will be involved, different academic units, and so on. And because of the variety of stakeholders, institutional policies, specifically that address data, could be in a single document, or they could be several documents that address this, different pieces of this. There was a study released in 2015, which was an analysis of 206 university data services and data policies. This study specifically looked at those research universities that had a Carnegie Very High or high classification specifically. And the authors of this study found that 44% of the institutions that they looked at had some kind of university level policy. Of those, 1/3 are intellectual property policies that talk about data. So this would be in the chart on the left. And 2/3 are policies that are standalone data policies, or 29% of the overall respondents to the survey. It's an important observation that they make that universities conducting more research are more likely to have a standalone data policy. For those other universities, it's more common for them to have data addressed within an intellectual property policy. As they quote, standalone data policies appear to more broadly cover different areas of data management, though the focus on retention and researcher separation suggests a significant university concern about legal repercussions rather than on sharing and dissemination. So a standalone data policy would address things like, again, definitions of data, defining who the data owner is, and they talk about retention and stipulations for when a researcher leaves. These are the things that a institutional standalone data policy might focus on, which is slightly different from what a funder policy would focus on when they're concerned with dissemination and sharing of research data. So there's a contrast there between those two different policies. So here we have two different types of policies affecting a researcher with two different sets of goals, and they may have some conflict amongst each other. The third type of policy that directly affects a researcher is publisher policies. Publisher policies are focused on data that supports their published claims. Increasingly, journals are issuing policies that require or recommend increased access to data underlying their published claims. For example, the Public Library of Science, which is a leader in this area, has some justifications for a data sharing policy, primarily the reproducibility of research. But not also just for validation, but also for reuse. So it's pointing to some efficiencies to authors that funder and institutional policies may not necessarily address. It makes it easier, for example, for an investigator or another investigator to access data to run another study if the data is available. An important reason why publishers have been putting out policies around data is because they want to be able to demonstrate that the findings they're publishing are sound. Retractions happen, and they happen are happening with increasing frequency, it seems. These are two examples of retractions from major journals. One from the New England Journal of Medicine. An article that was published in 2011 initially was retracted in 2013. In the 2 years that it was available, it had been cited almost 70 times. But there was some question with some of the tables in that paper, and the authors were not able to present the raw data underlying those figures, and so the paper was pulled. The same thing with the International Journal of Cancer. Excuse me. In this case, there was a paper published in 2006, which was retracted just this year, in 2016. So the paper had been available for 10 years. It had generated 25 citations in that time. Same thing. There were some questions about data within some of the figures. The authors were not able to deliver the fundamental data, and the paper was pulled. The author of the International Journal of Cancer noted, again, this was published initially in 2006, that at that time there were no rules that you had to keep the data and there was no retraction watch. So this whole area of publisher policies around data is changing, and people are becoming more and more concerned about where the data is. So this is going to be increasingly important for investigators who need to communicate their science. And there is, of course, a great deal of variety among different publisher policies for data and what they would like their authors to do with data. On the left, we have some examples from the University of Massachusetts. These are the top 10 journals that authors at the University of Massachusetts Medical School publish in. And you can see just from a brief look at this table, the requirements around data for each one of these journals individually are different. So at a practical level, every time someone who is going to be publishing a paper needs to review the policies of the journal that are involved. On the right, we have some common approaches of publishers to data policies. And the first one, like PLOS, is to make there's a requirement to make all of the data available without restriction and with as few exceptions to this rule as possible. This is the Public Library of Science policies are very thorough and a very good example of a publisher requiring data sharing and deposit. Nature Publishing Group, which publishes Nature, obviously, they ask their authors to submit data for peer review and require them to make data available to readers, but they don't necessarily stipulate how or where or when. They will make recommendations for certain repositories, like Figshare or Dryad, and they do require mandatory submission for certain kinds of data, specifically microarray data, protein sequences, genotype, phenotype data, etc. And they will also publish data as supplemental on site. So these publishers want to have access to the data, they want to be able to review it for publication, and they want to be able to point to it wherever it may live. We have other publishers, society publishers, and some large publishers that have specific journals who are focused on this, but they require data deposition as a part of the workflow. So in order to be published, for example, in Cell, a person will need to deposit their data into a publicly accessible database and provide an accession number for that data as a condition of publication. But that only holds for certain types of data. And if you are working with data that does not fit those types, then there are no requirements or policies for data in that case. And then there are those journals and publishers who encourage deposition of data, who encourage the inclusion of supplemental information in order to demonstrate the data underlying the figures, but they do not require it as a condition of publication or at all. So there's a very wide range of different approaches. And there is also sort of a group approach. There is a repository called Dryad, which is a data repository for biological and life sciences, and it has partnered with up to over 50 journals at this point to be the home for much of the underlying data for the papers that are published in those 50-odd journals. So they have a joint data archiving policy, which provides these journals with some common language that they can show to their authors regarding expectations for where that data needs to go. In all of these cases, the responsibility is on the author to comply with these policies. And this is, again, where it becomes very challenging for the researcher who may have one set of expectations from one publishing venue and another set from another publishing venue, depending on where they're going to be publishing their work, not to mention the institutional and funder requirements that are overlaid on top of that. So many things to think about. So what are the impact of these policies? Are they actually having an effect? In 2014, a study was released. It looked at, or it surveyed 3,000 life sciences, had a 41% response rate. And it was looking at the impact of data sharing policies, specifically in the life sciences, and looking across the policy types that we have talked about. And what they have found is interesting. The dark-colored bars here demonstrate a negative effect. The gray bars in the middle have, no effect, and then the light-colored bars show a favorable effect on data sharing. And what they have found through their study is that funder policies tend to have a more favorable impact on data sharing than specifically institutional policies or intellectual property policies, which have a chilling effect on data sharing. But interestingly, in the middle, you have journal policies as well as disciplinary norms and the influence of training and mentors that have a moderate effect on data sharing. So the NIH having the greatest impact on facilitating data sharing might lie in some of the infrastructure that they've put into place to support this data sharing. So they have established databases such as dbGaP in order to house some of the data that they have. And by reducing some administrative burden, it makes data sharing a little bit easier. Other findings from the study include that, fewer than a third of the reviewers did not consider data sharing plans to be important, that there were few sanctions or penalties for non-compliance. So in these cases, if you have the policies but there's no enforcement, nothing is going to happen if you don't actually comply with them. And more than 1/3 violated or did not know their institutional data policy. And that sort of speaks to the transparency within the institution about expectations around data and data management. So, but again, the U.S. agency responses to the Office of Science and Technology policy are just now being implemented. Again, this study was published in 2014. And there are continued numerous retractions. So the influence on behavior of researchers is going to change as more and more policies requiring data sharing are implemented by different agencies, and journals also enforce their policies as well. So with that in mind, that there are numerous policies that impact how an investigator at the level of practice might communicate their research, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about intellectual property and the ownership of data. Data is a research output, and like other different types of research outputs, it is intellectual property. Intellectual property are expected outcomes of research conducted at universities. It benefits the university and society to facilitate the development of discoveries and ideas, as well as to assure their availability to the public. So universities typically will develop policies and procedures relating to the ownership, use, management, and compensation for intellectual property created with their resources, like the institutional data policies that we have just been talking about. The question who owns data pertains to the individual or entity that has the legal right to the data and can retain the data after the completion of the project, can disseminate it. Essentially, who has legal control over the data? It's a complex question and depends on a given research situation. Because data is seen as an asset, different stakeholders want to protect their potential intellectual property. So the answer to who owns data is going to depend in part on the intellectual property policy of the institution and in part on where the funding for the research project is coming from. So there's generally 3 different types of funders, and they each have different objectives for their research. So they're going to have different approaches to ownership. A government, a federal funding agency, a government agency, is funding research to improve society, to improve the general health and welfare, and typically their rights to the products of research funded through them are given away to the institutions that they award. Philanthropic organizations are interested in focusing on a particular cause or issue. They may or may not give away their rights. They may want to hold on to their rights. And private funders or corporations are motivated as much by profit as they are by the benefits to society, so typically they are going to retain their rights. For federal grants, which is a major provider of research studies here, at least, the government gives the research institution the right to use the data that's collected with public funds as an incentive to put that research to use. So the institution owns the data. The funding agency is transferring their ownership to the institution. And the institution then uses their intellectual property policy to basically make a principal investigator the steward of that data. So the institution will own the data, but the PI is the person who is responsible for the collection of the data, the management of the data, its dissemination, its reporting, and communication. So graduate students, postdocs, or faculty involved in performing research on a particular grant may be wrong to assume that they own the data that they are collecting. Data and lab notebooks belong to the institution. Students should not take data with them when they leave the institution unless they have made appropriate arrangements with the project PI and the PI with the institution. A contract is a different kind of legal relationship that an institution or an investigator might get into with with a funding agency. And under grants, the researchers carry out the research and they submit reports. But again, the institution retains control of the data and the PI can do what they like. But under contracts, the researcher is required to deliver a product or a service, which is then controlled by the funding agency. So whether or not a research project is funded by a grant or by a contract is an important distinction to make. And it's a significant difference that could determine who can publish and use and disseminate the data produced from that research. So data and copyright. A copyrightable work is an original creative work that's set in a tangible format. Copyright ownership is ensured automatically when a work is fixed in that tangible format. We don't need a copyright symbol in order to identify copyrighted work. And what copyright does is it gives authors some exclusive rights over their work for a limited time, specifically the rights to reproduce it, to distribute it, to create derivative works, to perform it publicly. Copyright protection is available for most literary, musical, dramatic, photographic, and other types of creative works, including research articles, research monographs, textbooks, student theses, dissertations, and so forth. But copyright does not apply to works that are not fixed in a tangible format, to titles, names, and slogans, to ideas, facts, or data, or to lists of content and ingredients or works in the public domain. So there are some things that do not qualify for copyright protection. The current term of copyright is the life of the author plus 70 years. In the context of biomedical research data, facts and data are not copyrightable. Most research data is considered to be factual. So in many cases, copyright is not going to apply to research data. Instead, patents and trademarks might be more common. And institutions will have Office of Technology Policy or other equivalents to help investigators and students sort of manage those inquiries. That being said, the expression of data as well as compilations of data, can be protected. So while the data and the facts themselves cannot be, how they are manifest could be. So the chart or the figure or the image that is submitted to the publisher along with the manuscript is potentially copyrightable content. So Kristen Britty, a librarian at the University of Wisconsin, has some good advice for those who are producing or working with research data and want to know, how do I deal with this? How do you share your research data? So you need to think about whether or not the data that you're working with qualifies for copyright, first of all. If it does not qualify for copyright, you can control it by limiting how and whether or not you do share your data. If you do decide to share non-copyrightable your data, can release it into the public with a public domain waiver or Creative Commons Zero license. What this does is it makes the copyright status of the work clear and it enables easier reuse. If the data is creative enough to merit copyright, use a Creative Commons license to indicate appropriate use of that data. So if you want people to be able to share it, to be able to modify it, make money off of it or whatever, you can apply the appropriate Creative Commons license to that data. Can you use someone else's research data? If the data is licensed with a public domain waiver, Creative Commons Zero license, or another kind of license, you can use that if you do it in accordance with the license. You can use public domain data in your research, and you may be able to make a fair use justification for using someone's copyrighted content. Just remember to always cite your source. Creative Commons licenses, which I've mentioned, are free and easy to use licenses. They're a tool that enable a copyright owner to express how they want their works to be used. They have three layers. They are machine readable, they are human readable, and they're also legal documents, so lawyers can interpret them as well. So by using some of the restrictive language of traditional copyright, Creative Commons licenses have facilitated the open sharing and reuse of data. So they're a helpful tool for communicating your science.